Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really interesting period in American history today, what's often called the era of good feelings, from about 1816 to the late 1840s. When you hear that name, it sounds all, happy and unified, but was it really all that simple?
You hit the nail on the head. It's actually a time of, a lot of contradictions. Yeah, there was this sense of national unity on the surface, but just below that were these deep tensions and conflicts brewing. Think of it as like a simmering pot, you know? Things look calm from the outside, but there's a lot of heat and activity underneath.
So we're not just looking at the happy, smiley face of this era, we're going deeper. What should we know about the historical sources for this period? What kind of material are we working with here?
Well, we have a lot to work with, actually. We've got letters, diaries, speeches, newspaper articles from the time, all sorts of things. And the cool thing is these sources, they don't always agree. The
Yeah.
different people had different perspectives. So, yeah, by looking at all these different viewpoints, we can get a much richer understanding of um, what was really going on.
I like that. It's not just one side of the story. It's like we're putting together a giant puzzle, right? And each source is a piece that helps us see the bigger picture, like those panoramic puzzles, where you get all these tiny details, but then you step back and whoa, there's a whole landscape.
Exactly. And I think what's going to be really fun in this deep dive is sort of like you said, seeing how those pieces fit together. How did all these different trends and events and people interact to shape this era and set the stage for what was to come?
Okay, so where do we even begin? What makes 1816 the starting point for this era of good feelings?
1816, that's when James Monroe becomes president. And his election was kind of a landslide victory. It signaled the decline of the Federalist Party and ushered in this period of one-party rule by the Democratic Republicans. And so there was this feeling, at least among some, that a new chapter of unity and national purpose was beginning.
We like those fresh starts, don't we? New beginnings.
Oh, absolutely. And we actually have a quote that kind of sums up this feeling of optimism. It's from Hezekiah Niles. He was a journalist. And he wrote this in his newspaper, the Weekly Register, in 1815. He says, "A high and honorable feeling generally prevails, and the people begin to assume more and more a national character, and to look at home for the only means under divine goodness of preserving their religion and liberty."
Okay, so that quote, it definitely paints a picture of unity and optimism, but we've already hinted that things weren't quite as rosy as they might seem. So what were some of these tensions that were bubbling under the surface?
Well, even Niles himself acknowledged that there were already debates brewing, debates over things like tariffs, internal improvements, and the big one, slavery. It was already causing friction and division, even as people talked about unity and national growth. These disagreements, they would eventually explode into major conflicts later on.
So it's kind of like that family portrait where everyone's smiling for the camera,
Right.
but you can just sense that there's some drama going on behind the scenes.
That's a great analogy. And it wasn't just limited to politics either. This era of good feelings also saw the rise of what we call cultural nationalism. It was this movement that aimed to create a distinct American identity. Think about like Parson Weems. He wrote that famous biography of George Washington, the one with the cherry tree story. And it basically turned Washington into this almost mythical hero.
Yeah, like the American ideal, right? Honest Abe, the cherry tree.
Exactly. And then you have Noah Webster with his blueback speller. He wanted to standardize American English, like make it distinct from British English. So there's this real push to define what it meant to be American.
It makes sense, right?
Hmm.
After the War of 1812, there's this sense of we beat the British, we're a real country now. And, they're figuring out, well, what does that actually mean? What is an American?
That's exactly it. And at the same time as all this is happening, the nation is, expanding westward. We have this Louisiana Purchase territory just waiting to be explored and settled. And that westward expansion brings its own set of challenges, and really starts to expose those cracks in national unity.
Okay, so we have a map here showing the Louisiana Purchase and the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Tell me about this. This feels like a turning point, like one of those moments where those cracks start to become, more like canyons.
You're right on the money. Westward expansion, it was driven by a bunch of factors. We got Florida from Spain in 1819. Transportation was getting better, roads, canals, steamboats, you name it. And then there was the lure of cheap land and new opportunities out west. But as more and more settlers moved west, that question of slavery just kept getting harder and harder to ignore.
Right, because remember, slavery was already legal in many of the original states. It wasn't some new problem.
Absolutely. And when Missouri applied for statehood in 1819 and they wanted to be a slave state, well, that just threw everything into chaos. It threatened to upset this delicate balance between free states and slave states in the Senate.
Why was that balance so crucial? Like, why was everyone freaking out about Missouri becoming a slave state?
So the thing is, each state, regardless of how many people live there, gets two senators, right? So adding Missouri as a slave state would have given the slave states more power in the Senate. And a lot of people in the North, they were not happy about that. They saw it as a threat to, their interests and their values.
It's interesting how, even back then, representation and political power, those were huge issues. And this is where the Missouri Compromise comes in.
Right.
How do they try to, put out this fire?
So Henry Clay, he's like the master negotiator,
Mhm.
steps in and brokers this compromise. It was classic political maneuvering. So they admit Missouri is a slave state, but to keep things balanced, they carve Maine out of Massachusetts and admit Maine as a free state. Problem solved, right?
Not so fast. We have this map, and I see a line drawn across the Louisiana Purchase territory. What's that all about?
Ah, you caught that. So to try and prevent future fights, the compromise also said, okay, no slavery north of the 36-degree 30 minutes parallel line in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory.
It seems like they were kind of kicking the can down the road, hoping that by containing slavery to certain areas, they could avoid a bigger fight. Did people really think this would actually solve the problem of slavery?
You know, it's amazing. Many people, even some very important politicians, actually believed that this compromise would put the whole slavery issue to bed. They thought, okay, we drew a line, we're good now. But they totally underestimated how deeply rooted slavery was, not just in the economy, but in the American psyche. This compromise, while it was a big deal at the time, it didn't really solve anything. It just delayed the inevitable confrontation.
Oh boy. So the era of good feelings, it's already getting a bit complicated. And we haven't even talked about Henry Clay's American system. What was that all about?
Oh, the American system. Well, that was Clay's, big plan to boost the economy and yeah, try to strengthen national unity. It had three main parts, like a three-legged stool, protective tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements like roads and canals. Clay, he believed that these things would work together to make the U.S. more self-sufficient and prosperous.
So the tariffs protect American businesses, the bank keeps the money flowing smoothly, and the roads and canals connect everything and make trade easier. Sounds like a solid plan.
It was a bold vision, that's for sure. And it had its fans, especially in the North, where, manufacturing was really starting to take off. But it also had a lot of people who hated it, mostly in the South. They relied on imported goods, and they were worried that the tariffs would hurt their agricultural exports.
So even when trying to bring the country together economically, those sectional differences just kept popping up. It's like they couldn't escape them.
Nope. And to make matters worse, the Panic of 1819 hit. That was a major economic downturn, really threw a wrench into the whole era of good feelings vibe.
A panic.
Yeah.
That doesn't
Yeah.
sound good. What caused this economic meltdown, and how did it impact this supposed era of unity and good feelings?
It was the first big financial crisis the U.S. had ever faced, and it really shook things up. It was a perfect storm of bad stuff happening all at once. Too much speculation on land out west, easy credit from state banks, and then a drop in demand for American goods from Europe. The result: banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, prices plummeted, and people lost their jobs. It was rough.
Wow. So much for good feelings, right? It seems like this panic really exposed the fragility of the American economy, and maybe even that sense of national unity.
Absolutely. It definitely tarnished that image of harmony that had been so strong in the early years of Monroe's presidency. And it had a big impact on politics, too, contributed to the decline of the Federalist Party and led to the rise of new factions within the Democratic-Republican Party.
So while all this economic and political drama is playing out, we have John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of quietly shaping the nation's legal landscape in the background.
John Marshall. Now, there was a brilliant legal mind, a staunch Federalist, too, even though the Federalist Party was, kind of fading away. He understood that for this young nation to survive, it needed a strong central government. And he used his position on the court to really boost federal power and limit the influence of the individual states.
I'm sensing a theme here. National power over state power. Okay, so how did he actually go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, two big Supreme Court cases during his time really show his impact. McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819 and Dartmouth College v. Woodward that same year. In McCulloch, the court said, yep, the national bank is constitutional. States can't mess with federal institutions.
So a major win for the feds.
Big time. And then in Dartmouth College v. Woodward, they protected private contracts from state interference. Basically, the court said states can't just come in and change contracts or mess with businesses. These rulings had a huge impact on the balance of power between the federal government and the states. They really laid the groundwork for a much stronger national government down the road.
So while everyone else is focused on the ups and downs of the economy and all the growing pains of westward expansion, John Marshall's over there playing the long game, quietly but strategically building a more powerful and unified nation. It's wild how everything's connected, Politics, economics, the law, it's all intertwined.
It's all part of the story. And we can't forget about foreign policy. While all this is happening at home, the U.S. is starting to flex its muscles on the world stage. And that brings us to the Monroe Doctrine. That was a bold statement, really showed that America was, ambitious and ready to protect its interests.
I'm getting don't mess with us vibes from the Monroe Doctrine. What was going on in the world that led to this declaration? And what were the main points?
So by the 1820s, Europe had kind of gotten over the Napoleonic Wars, and the monarchs, they were starting to get nervous about all these revolutions happening in Latin America. Some even talked about helping Spain take back its colonies. And the U.S., well, we just won our own independence, and we were not about to let Europe come waltzing back into the Americas and start bossing people around.
So it was like, we did all this work to get free, and now you want to come back and recolonize everything. No way.
Exactly. So in 1823, President Monroe, he includes this statement in his annual message to Congress. It basically said, hey, Europe, the Americas are closed for business. No more colonizing over here. And while you're at it, don't even think about interfering with those new Latin American republics. It was a shot across the bow.
Boom. Mic drop. But, the U.S. was still a pretty young country back then. Did we really have the military power to back up such a bold statement?
That's the thing. When the Monroe Doctrine came out, it wasn't really backed up by a powerful military. It was more like a statement of principles, a declaration of intent.
Yeah.
But it did show the world that the U.S. was ready to play ball in international affairs. It was like, we're here and we're a force to be reckoned with, and this Western Hemisphere, it's our turf.
So the Monroe Doctrine, even if it didn't have any teeth at the time, it was a sign of things to come. A more assertive American foreign policy was on the horizon.
You got it. And it's another example of how this era of good feelings, even though it was all about, unity and growth, it also laid the groundwork for some of the biggest challenges and triumphs in American history.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground already, and it's clear that the era of good feelings was a lot more complicated than the name suggests. It was a time of contradictions, progress and setbacks, unity and division. What stands out to you as most significant about this period so far?
I think what's striking is how this era really set the stage for what's coming next in American history. All these things we've been talking about, the changes in the economy, westward expansion, the debates about slavery, and the U.S. becoming more powerful in the world, all these things, they're going to converge and lead to some really dramatic events in the mid-19th century.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating era. There's so much more to uncover. We'll delve deeper into the economic and social transformations of the time in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
So as we dig deeper into this era of good feelings, it becomes super clear that this was a time of massive change, especially when it comes to the economy. It's like the roots of modern American capitalism, they're really taking hold here. The country's shifting from, mostly farming to one that's driven by industry and commerce.
Right. And we left off last time talking about that panic of 1819 and how it kind of showed just how vulnerable the economy was. But even with that economic turmoil, there was still a lot of growth and innovation happening. Our sources mention things like population growth, improvements in transportation, and the rise of factories. It seems like everything was just moving faster, changing at a breakneck pace.
Yeah, that's a great observation. This is the era of the market revolution, a huge shift from this, local self-sufficient economy to this interconnected national market economy. Between 1800 and 1850, the U.S. population, it almost quadrupled.
Wow.
That's insane. It is. And all these people, they need jobs, they need goods and services, they're moving west. It's a whirlwind of activity.
More people, more goods, more movement. It's hard to imagine how the country's infrastructure could even keep up with all that growth.
Oh, transportation improvements, they were absolutely key to this whole transformation. We were talking before about roads, canals, and steamboats opening up the West, making trade easier. Well, those innovations, they completely changed the game in the East, too. The Erie Canal, finished in 1825, that connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. It was a game changer. Suddenly, shipping costs plummeted, and New York City, it became the nation's busiest port.
The Erie Canal, that was a big deal, wasn't it?
Huge deal. It was like this incredible feat of engineering. It showed just how ambitious and innovative the country was. And along with canals, you have steamboats making river travel faster and more efficient. And then you start to see the first railroads popping up, although they weren't very extensive yet. But it was a sign of things to come.
So it's like all of a sudden the country's getting smaller. It's easier to move people, raw materials, finished goods. It's creating a truly national market, right?
Exactly. And as all this is happening with these improved transportation systems and this expanding market, well, factories start popping up everywhere, especially in the Northeast.
Makes sense. You need factories to produce all those goods for this growing market. So what were some of the big inventions that fueled this industrial boom?
Well, this was a time when American ingenuity was just exploding. You have Eli Whitney, and we've already talked about him and the cotton gin, but during the War of 1812, he came up with this idea of interchangeable parts.
Interchangeable parts. That sounds pretty basic.
I know, right? But it was revolutionary. See, before that, every part had to be made by hand individually. But with interchangeable parts, you could use machines to crank out identical parts, which meant you could assemble things faster, repairs were simpler, and mass production became possible.
Ah, so it's not just about making more stuff. It's about making stuff faster, more efficiently. And that changes everything for industry.
Exactly. And as businesses get bigger and they're producing more, they need more money to grow, right?
Yeah, they need capital.
Exactly. And so you see the rise of corporations. It was a new way to organize businesses.
Mm.
Basically, they could sell shares of stock and raise a ton of money. And that just fueled even more industrial expansion.
Okay, so far this all sounds like, progress, innovation, good times. But I'm guessing not everyone was benefiting equally from these economic changes.
Yeah.
I mean, our sources mention things like social change, labor unrest, urbanization, and they don't exactly sound like a walk in the park. It's like there's this dark side to the market revolution.
Oh, absolutely. The market revolution, while it created new opportunities for some, it definitely created some big challenges too. So factories, they need workers, right? And so people, they leave their farms, they head to the cities looking for work. And what do they find? Long hours, dangerous conditions, and not much pay.
Yeah, factory work in the 19th century, not exactly known for its great working conditions.
Nope. And so, cities, they're growing super fast. There's overcrowding, poverty, social problems everywhere. Cities weren't ready for this kind of growth.
Right. And these new factory workers, I mean, they didn't have much power to bargain for better pay or safer conditions, did they?
Not really, but this is when you start to see the very beginnings of labor organizations, unions. Workers, men, women, even children, they're trying to band together to get better treatment, to have some say in how things are run. But it's an uphill battle. The factory owners, they have a lot of power, and the government's mostly on their side.
It's amazing how some things never seem to change. That tension between the opportunities created by economic growth and the challenges faced by the workers, it's a theme that runs through American history.
It really does. The market revolution, it laid the groundwork for the kind of capitalism we see today, but it also made those social and economic inequalities even worse. And those issues, low wages, dangerous working conditions, those are things that people are still fighting for today.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always, progress for everyone.
For sure. And while all this is happening in the North, the South is going through its own economic transformation, driven mostly by, you guessed it, cotton.
King cotton. We talked about the cotton gin earlier. How did that invention change the South?
Oh, the cotton gin, that was a game changer, but not necessarily in a good way. It made growing cotton super profitable, but it also meant that the demand for slave labor skyrocketed. Plantations, they were expanding everywhere, and the planter elite, well, they got super rich and powerful.
So we have these two very different systems developing. The North's all about industry and wage labor, while the South is doubling down on agriculture and slavery. Two completely different visions for the future of the country.
The contrast is striking. And it's important to remember we're not just talking about economics here. This is about the lives of real people. Enslaved Africans forced to work in horrific conditions to produce the cotton that's fueling not just the South's economy, but the global textile industry, too.
It feels like the era of good feelings was also this time of, you know, intense moral reckoning. The country's getting richer, more powerful, but it's all built on this foundation of slavery. That's a hard pill to swallow.
And it's a dilemma that's going to become impossible to ignore. Some people thought, okay, slavery will just sort of fade away eventually. But with the cotton boom and westward expansion, that was looking less and less likely. The Missouri Compromise, it tried to contain slavery, but it was obvious that the problem wasn't going away.
So we have all these seemingly separate things happening: national identity, economic growth, new technology, social change, and then this moral question of slavery. And they're all getting tangled up together. It's a really complex picture.
And that's what makes studying this era so fascinating. It's not just dates and names, it's about real people facing real challenges and making choices that would change the course of history.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore. We haven't even talked about the acquisition of Florida or, foreign policy beyond the Monroe Doctrine. And what about life for people who weren't living in cities or working on plantations? What was happening in rural America during this time?
There's a lot more to uncover as we continue our deep dive into this era of good feelings. Stick with us as we explore these fascinating aspects of this pivotal time in American history.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the era of good feelings. We've been exploring this period of, really dramatic transformation in American history: economic growth, new technologies, westward expansion, and of course the ever-present challenge of slavery. We've seen how these forces that really shaped the nation's identity and kind of set the stage for those conflicts that would erupt in the mid-19th century.
And as we get into the later years of this era, those forces, they become even more intertwined. You get this really complex mix of progress and contradiction.
Right. Before we get too far ahead, though, we kind of skimmed over the acquisition of Florida and foreign policy beyond the Monroe Doctrine last time. Can we circle back to those topics for a bit?
Yeah.
You mentioned that Florida had become this haven for escaped slaves and a real source of tension with Spain. So how did they finally get control of Florida?
Yeah, Florida was a problem for the U.S. It was a place where people escaping slavery could go. And, you had the Seminole, the indigenous people of Florida. They were raiding across the border, causing all sorts of trouble. And then in 1818, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory himself, he leads this military campaign into Florida.
Jackson was not known for being cautious.
No, not at all. He was after those raiders who'd been hitting Georgia, and he ended up crashing with Spanish forces, too. It was a pretty bold move.
So Jackson basically, he forced Spain's hand,
Yeah.
right? Made them negotiate.
Oh, he definitely put the pressure on. The Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, that's what officially gave Florida to the U.S. It got rid of a source of tension. Yeah, and it gave the U.S. control of the whole southeastern border. Plus, it opened up more land for expansion. But, and this is important, this expansion, it came at a cost for the Seminole. They were forced off their land. It's a tragic story that was repeated over and over again as the U.S. expanded westward.
It's a reminder that, progress, it often has this dark side, especially when it comes to how indigenous peoples were treated. It's something that we see throughout this era. So we've talked about industrialization in the North and the cotton boom in the South. But what about everyone else? What about those folks who weren't part of those big economic transformations? What was life like in rural America?
So you have the market revolution and industrialization changing the North. You have the cotton boom transforming the South. But yeah, in rural America, life, it still revolved around agriculture. People were living in these small, close-knit communities. But even there, even in these rural areas, you see the impact of these larger economic forces.
How so? I mean, if they're not working in factories or on plantations, how are they affected?
Well, the cities are growing, right?
Hmm.
Factories are popping up, and that creates a demand for, for food, for agricultural products. So farmers, they're not just growing food for themselves in their local community anymore. They're selling to these national markets.
So even if they weren't working in a factory, those farmers, they were still part of the shift to a more interconnected economy.
Exactly. And this change, It had, both good and bad consequences for rural communities. On the one hand, farmers had the chance to make more money. They could sell more of what they produced, but it also made them more dependent on those distant markets, and they were vulnerable to price fluctuations. And then, of course, you have improvements in transportation, roads, canals, railroads, those things. They connected those rural communities to the national market, too.
It seems like there was no escaping these massive changes sweeping across the country.
That's right. The market revolution, westward expansion, the rise of industry, they impacted every aspect of American life. They changed how people worked, how they lived, even how they thought about themselves and their place in this new nation.
And speaking of changing roles, one group that really experienced some significant shifts during this time, that was women.
Hmm.
We've got sources that mention new opportunities for women, but also, the same old social constraints. Feels like a time of transition for them,
Yeah.
sort of caught between tradition and these forces of modernity.
It was a time of transition for women, for sure, just like it was for the country as a whole. The market revolution and the rise of factories, they did create new opportunities for women to work outside the home, especially in textile mills and garment factories. And this new economic independence, it was a challenge to those traditional ideas about what women's role should be. It gave them new possibilities, new ways to support themselves.
But working outside the home, that didn't suddenly make women equal to men, did it?
Oh, of course not. Those old ideas about women, that their place was in the home, focused on domesticity and motherhood, those ideas were still really strong. A lot of people saw women working outside the home as like a temporary thing, something they did until they got married and had kids. And to be honest, for many women, especially those in rural areas or, from poorer backgrounds, those opportunities to work outside the home, they were limited anyway. Their lives, they still revolved around family and their local community.
So some progress for some women, but still within a system that defined them, based on these traditional ideas about gender roles.
Exactly. Historical change, it's rarely a straight line. It's messy, it's uneven. Some groups, they experience progress faster than others.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the era of good feelings, I think it's safe to say that it was a time of, well, a lot of things. Amazing progress, some serious challenges. It was a time that shaped the nation's identity, laid the foundation for economic expansion, and really set the stage for those conflicts that would define the mid-19th century.
It's an era full of contradictions. You have this surge of national unity, and at the same time, this growing sectional division. You have economic growth, but also social upheaval. You have incredible technological innovation, but these deeply rooted social inequalities are still there.
It's a reminder that history, it's rarely simple, it's complex, it's a tapestry with all these different threads. And it's our job to try to untangle those threads, see how they connect to the world we live in today.
Couldn't agree more. As you continue to learn about this period in American history, think about the legacy of the era of good feelings. How did it shape the country? Politically, economically, socially, and how do we still see its impact today?
Those are fantastic questions. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the era of good feelings. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.